Foucault may be saying to Chomsky in the famous debate that the difficulty with justice is that justice is a concept which is born, which has its ursprung, its original ground, out of the unequal society, out of the society where, as Aristotle observes, it always so happens that the poor outnumber the rich. And then one can see in various episodes in history where the consciousness of this disparity becomes more acute, such as in our own epoch, but it's happened quite a few times prior to our own time. What is the use and what follows from what follows from this seeking of genealogies of ideas, and how so far could they ever come into an afterglow of the prejudices, as it were, to use Nietzsche's term. Justice may prove simply to be a prejudice of some kind, as Nietzsche says we have to have prejudices for the sake of life. If we would show that Heidegger's Dasein is the result, for instance, of, as Heidegger himself admits in a large sense, of the Western history, but is the result of specific fashions and wanderings and paths taken. So, for instance, essentially, the account that is most usually given, which has quite a bit of credibility, is the early modernity begins to focus on the notion of the so-called sense data and radically shaves the judgment and all the higher things off the face of the intellectual map, so that Bacon says we need to get rid of the so-called idols, everything which follows on the sense data. And then this eventually leads to the view, Bacon and Descartes are very close in time, but this leads to the view of the so-called representations, that everything is a representation, the world is a representation. And essential to that, I would say, is and then what I'm trying to get to is that Dasein is then can be seen as an answer to this view of the core interpretation of reality. So it seems that the essence of the concept of representation can be given by this thought that space is not given. What does that mean to say space is not given? This is very unnatural, and this was the response of the so-called quote-unquote common sense schools, which in a funny way, even though Zizek would disavow it, he resembles the common sense schools, even though he claims to be a Kantian. So what is the claim? What is supposed to be viewed here in this idea of representation? Basically, even in the pre-Husserlian phenomenology, we have this view that if something is at a distance, the sun, for instance, in common sense, we assume that the sun looks small in the sky because it's so far away. We assume that the space is something given. But what they're saying is, it's simply that's the way we represent it. If you go through the reflections in Bishop Berkeley, or Berkeley, as the Americans say, you see this idea elaborated from the point of view of someone who was arguing for what he understood as common sense. In fact, Berkeley repeatedly makes comments along the line of how stupid the philosophers are, and how his view is the view of that corresponds to common sense, and that the philosophers' views are such that no Irishman can attain to these views, as he says ironically. Is the claim that space is not given at all cogent here? So if you just look, putting aside these questions of primary and secondary qualities and like that, whether colors are given differently, whether the tetrachromic eyeball sees things different with different colors than the so-called ordinary eyeball with three color parts, cones, and things like that. Putting aside this question of subjectivity, everything that we encounter is just something that has a color. The surface of things is color. Otherwise, there's nothing for us. But space, the air, as it were, is invisible. Things at a distance, when we walk close to things, they're bigger. When we're further away, they're smaller. But is this simply because that's the way we're representing them to ourselves? This whole discussion, which absorbs the thinking for hundreds of years, draws into question the common sense attitude. One could say with complete cogency that it brings into question the common sense attitude, whether or not it's actually cogent in itself. From this point of view, I wonder if one can say, in a way, Dasein is the vague everyday sense, insofar as Heidegger says, at least this aspect of Dasein, let's say. Heidegger says the vague everyday sense of reality is nonetheless true. So the facticitat of Dasein then might move between these two views, between the sense that space is given and space is not given. But in any case, that vagueness is given to Dasein. So in this sense, Dasein offers a third position, as it were, not the supposed common sense which comes into all kinds of difficulties, because with the view of the anthropologist, that the common sense is different depending on your culture, and there's n number of cultures, or the view of the German, which becomes German idealism in its most acute form, as it were, in Kant and then Hegel and so forth. But that these views are all available to Dasein in some way. Now, what difference does it make that this is coming to us supposedly from the past? Again, we can ask here, is the past, so in a more radical form than space, we can say even, is the past something that is given? Perhaps more radical. So is the past and our influence of the past something that's given and something which must have a causal effect? We can go into all kinds of questions about the cogency of the concepts of causality and the common sense pistis, or reliance on the sense of causality, and so on. But there's another register here, which is the source, as it were, the opening of Dasein, vis aquella, that source, which corresponds to what I call the genetic circle. there's constantly new starting points, as it were. Every time we have a new reflection, we could suddenly be impelled, as it were. We could find the urgency, the overall worlding essence of something that, as it were, in Arignus would open up a new look of all things, right? Um, and give us a new outlook at once in this contest within itself, in this vigorous contestation within itself, between the vigorous contestants of the thing that has the look and us with the outlook. There is this opening, as it were, and it's a source which is not historical. This is how it seems to be in Dasein. There's the contest of the history of being on the one hand, but then the source which is not historical on the other side. I end by mentioning that I came across or remembered in Virginia Woolf in her book on A Room with a View, which was written in 28, a year after the release of Being in Time, the following. I, in inverted commas, is only a convenient term for somebody who has no real being. So one can see how the sum, or the being filled out with the knowledge of death, the possibility of the enigmatic outpouring of fate or chance coming upon us, our exposure to guilt, the mood that we move along with, the absence and presence, in the sense that bleeds over into a deeper sense of the unconscious, as in Jung, which I realized that it seems simply impossible to make Jung's concept of the unconscious link to Freud's, because they're quite different, which I was going into in an earlier recording. And the other content of the quote-unquote I, which gives it, as it were, a proper content rather than the empty I, which then gives it seemingly a historical content. And it includes also, with Heidegger, the sense of the peculiar tendency towards decisions, which we see in an individual Dasein, as it were. This sense of the real being, of the content of the I with inverted, of the denied I, reminds in close of what Dennett says when he says Dennett's denial that consciousness is not stuff, where he says if the consciousness becomes stuff, then you can see it's in the world, right? And then in the same way, when the I becomes all its contents, the contents have to be somewhere, as it were, but we don't limit it. I don't think Dennett can do it either, because he admits there's the problem of the Nietzsche's problem of the I can't. It's the I that we see with can't be making the whole world. Therefore, he is in a sense data type of picture, but if he says he can't say consciousness is just in the brain, right? The stuff would have to be including the sense data, and the sense data is the representation, and the representation is just what, from the old common sense point of view, we would call the world. All the leaves on the ground, walls, human beings, and so on. The sense of the permeation of the I in its proper being in the world is surely then part of the Dasein concept. But then, is this only that we are now will be seduced to heighten our consciousness of this concept and therefore to force it on ourselves as a form, as a new form of understanding, as Nietzsche quotes Bartold Niebuhr to say that coming into this intensity, because of the intensity of their consciousness, they get their fellows to go along with these new forms. And Dasein could be such a form.